I've gotten to see people I haven't seen in a long time, and very happy to see you guys. I'm glad to hear you're all doing well. And some of you I've seen just even a month ago. I asked Mom when I came back home how long it had been since I've been away, and she said a month. And it doesn't seem like that long to me. My life's just kind of passing by right now, mostly because of school and how busy that is. But regardless, I'm very happy to see you, and I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Fame, glory, recognition. We all seek it. Some people, in fact, spend their entire lives seeking these very things. You'll see it maybe on concrete as you're walking by when someone is laying concrete. It's finalizing and hardening. People will come up with little sticks, or they'll put their finger in there and write their name in there. So everywhere the person goes, he'll see his or her name on that concrete, and for that person at least, that's gratifying. My name is on that concrete, and unless they, pave it back over, it will never be gone. We see the same thing in Hollywood. People put their names on the street. That way, at one of the most most well-recognized places in the world, people will be walking on the names of these legends, these actors, and these famous people. Some people seek fame so strongly that the only place they will actually be recognized is on their gravestone. You and I can be the same way. We want recognition. Some part of it's natural. We want some kind of affection. We want some kind of attention from other people. But today I want to talk about someone who maybe be the least well-known person in the entire Bible. In fact, he's only mentioned once. Let's turn again to Acts 13, verse 1. Acts 13, verse 1. Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a member of the court of Herod the Tetrarch. Manaen. If you've ever heard of Manaen in your Bible study, then you've probably done a lot more Bible study than I have. Because when I was doing this lesson, I had never heard of the name Manaen before. So who was this man, Manaen? And exactly what did he do that shows some kind of example that we can take in our own lives? So first of all, we can understand from Manaen that he responded to God appropriately. He responded to God appropriately when he saw what God had for him. Manaen was converted by action. If you have in your Bible maybe a New King James Version or a King James Version, you might have this phrase: Manaen was a foster brother to Herod. If you have something like a NASB, you might have Manaen was a lifelong friend of Herod. My translation says that Manaen was a member of the court of Herod the Tetrarch. Well, the problem is in the Greek, this word is actually the same. It means foster brother, it means lifelong friend, and it can also mean, in one circumstance, this being the only one, a member of the court. We're going to land on the side that that Manaen knew Herod from birth. All the translators I've looked at, all the more correct translations claim that that's the right translation. So we're going to assume this morning that Manaen knew Herod from their very birth. And look at what a few translators have to say about the word foster brother here. The first one we have is from the Baker Exegetical Commentary on Acts, and it says this: Manaen is described as one raised with Herod, as the term centrophos means one who eats together or nurses together with someone else. The Pulpit Commentary says this: the foster brother may equally mean one nourished at the same time at the same breast, which would indicate that Manaen's mother was a wet nurse to Herod the Tetrarch, or that Manaen was a playmate of Herod. And so we see that Manaen has strong connections with Herod and his family. So what do we see in Acts chapter 12 as was read by Bud to us this morning? We see in Acts chapter 12 that, first of all, at the beginning of the chapter, that Herod decides to make an example of these Christians. Remember back in Acts 2, the church is finally and officially established on Pentecost, and so Christianity is still relatively new. And the persecution begins really in Acts 7 with his name just escaped me, with Stephen, with the stoning of Stephen, excuse me. And so we see that persecution is fairly new. We see that Christianity is still fairly new. What Herod is going to do is make an example of these new Christians. So he takes James and he kills him with the sword. And he sees that the Jews like this. So what he's going to do now is he's going to take Peter, one of their main guys, I guess you could say, and he's going to throw him into prison. What he decides to do at the end of the chapter is to put on a big robe and a big show for the Jews. And what he's going to make himself look like is that he is in the position of God himself. And so what happens to Herod at the end of this chapter? Well, he's struck down with worms, and he's eaten alive. That's the image that the Bible gives us. And then, ironically, in chapter 13, verse 1, we read about a man named Manaen. Is it mere consequence that that's the sequence of order things went into? I'm not really sure, because it's obviously Luke put it in there for some reason that Manaen was a lifelong friend of Herod, and Herod, the great tetrarch of Jerusalem, was just struck down. But the lesson we can get from Manaen was that he was converted by his actions, and Manaen let his reason dictate his actions. Think about this. Before Manaen was a Christian, before he was even serving in the church at Antioch, where was Manaen? Manaen was in a position of power. Manaen had grown up with Herod the Tetrarch. Manaen had all this kind of influence, all this kind of social status among the Jews. He was affiliated with power. So what happened? Once he noticed that his friend, his lifelong friend who he grew up with, Herod, the man who probably had the most power that he knew of, was struck dead by some god who he thought he believed in, all of a sudden there's a shift in power. And so Manaen decides, instead of following his lifelong friend Herod who had the power, he's now going to decide to follow the one who has the ultimate and greatest power, which is God, which was a reasonable act on his part. Manaen's moment with God was similar to Moses' moment with God we find in Exodus 4. Turn there with me if you will. Exodus chapter 4. We'll read verses 11 and 12. We understand the story of Moses. Moses was essentially a prince of Egypt, I guess by adoption. But then he got into some trouble. He killed one of the Egyptian guards because he was mistreating one of his Hebrew brethren. And so then he ran away in fear of, I guess, persecution. And so then God comes to him and says, well, Moses, I know you want to do this, but now I've got something else planned for you. And what does Moses do? He makes excuses. He says, no, I can't do it. And God kind of finally gets tired of it. So in Exodus 4 we read this. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Do you think Manaen maybe thought of this example as he was being converted? Do you think maybe the life he was living before all of a sudden didn't matter to him at all? Because he was having one of these, if you will, Moses moments. And if you're in Manaen's positions right now, you're thinking, I've got the power, I've got the social status, nothing can touch me except for probably the Roman government. And they're not going to come here. So I'm good. And all of a sudden his best friend, his connection to power, is struck dead. And all of a sudden he is left with the reality that the God holds the ultimate power in the universe. And so his actions were dictated by his reason, by the evidence that he saw. And consequently, we should also live by faith and reason. Some people are converted by different means. Some people may be converted by our example. If we go out and we act appropriately like the Bible asks us to do, then we may convert some people simply by our own example. That's powerful. Because if one person goes around preaching something that he doesn't really believe, it's going to show in his actions. It's going to show by the way he lives his life. That's one way we can convert people, is by our example. But also, people can be converted by providence. While we don't know how this works, we don't fully understand the way God works, we understand this is true. We look at Philip and the eunuch in Acts chapter 8 and understand that's totally providence. God came to Philip and said, hey, there's someone on the road. You need to go right now and go. We would call that providence. We would call that direct intervention. But ultimately, the way we need to be converted and the way we need to convert people is by reason. Is by a fair estimate of the situation, a fair judgment of our own stances with God and with our eternal salvation. And from that, we understand that the only way to get to heaven is through God, through His Son Jesus Christ. It needs to be dictated by reasons as Manaen's was. A second thing this morning we can learn from Manaen is that Manaen was faithful. Manaen, after he was converted, didn't just simply sit back and say, well, now I'm a follower of Christ. Now I really got nothing else to do except for sit in the pew and wait for the Lord to come back, I guess. Let's read how Manaen was faithful. Let's go ahead and read the first 3 verses of Acts 13. We can realize how faithful he was. Acts 13:1. Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers. There were prophets and teachers. And Manaen is listed as one of either a prophet or a teacher. Acts 13:2. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting. While they, that complete group at the church, were worshiping and fasting. Verse 3, then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. Manaen was not satisfied after his conversion with being a pew warmer, if you will. He was not willing to let himself sit back and essentially saturate on his new knowledge. Manaen was a person of action because he saw what God had for him, and he saw the consequence if he did not respond accordingly to God. Additionally, we know that Manaen was not afraid to be known. It's not really clear where Manaen was living at the time that Herod was struck down. We do know that Jerusalem was way down south here, and Antioch was way up here in maybe southern Turkey, modern-day Turkey as we know it now. So we don't really know if Manaen was living in Jerusalem when Herod was struck down and then moved up to Antioch, or we don't know if Manaen was living in Antioch and just found a local church there. But we know that Manaen was not afraid to be known. He was of high social standing, and he was highly involved in the congregation. And the people would have noticed this. The Jews would have noticed what Manaen was doing. Look at Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. Read verses 19 through 25. Manaen's situation had to be similar in some way to Paul's. Whenever Paul was converted, because the Jews started coming after him. Read in verse 19, and taking food he was strengthened. For some days he was with the disciples at Damascus, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogue, saying, He is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, Is this not the man who, is this not the man, sorry, off the place. Is this not the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength, and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. Do you think Manaen's situation possibly was the same? The Jews would have talked, just like they talked about Paul. Where did Manaen go? Do you know where Manaen went? I mean, Herod was just struck down. Where is Manaen? Is he working in that congregation, that Christian church up in Antioch? Is he a prophet in that church at Antioch? Is he working with Paul in that church at Antioch? Word would have gotten around. And Manaen's life, no doubt, would have been in danger, like every other Christian's life in the first century was in danger. But Manaen was not afraid to be known to anyone. And Manaen's example of faithfulness is biblical to us. It's one that we need to emulate and we need to follow. He lived his life in sin. He came into contact with the divine. He changed his life, and then he was faithful. Manaen was brought in to be an example, no doubt. Surely by divine providence, Luke was obliged to add Manaen into the text for everyone to see for the rest of, the existence of the world. The same thing happens with our churches today. Sometimes we are afraid of our past. Sometimes we're afraid of things we've done, and rightly so, many of the sins that we committed, we should be ashamed that we did them. But if we really recognize that we're past that, if we really recognize that with Christ we can move past that, live productive lives for Him, we need to take our examples of the lives we used to live and help others with those struggles. Your sins are probably different than mine. Actually, for many of us, I know that my sins are different than yours in a lot of ways. Could it not make one feel ostracized if he went forward one Sunday and he confessed a sin that maybe we consider to be awful? We consider it to be deviant and just socially unacceptable. What if no one came to that person and sympathized? What if no one came to that person and encouraged him? The church isn't about ostracism. The church isn't about exclusion from the body. The church is about inclusion and bonding through Christ. I want to encourage you this morning to take your own examples, take your own previous lives, and empathize with someone. Grab someone and kind of tutor them, or kind of talk about your struggles. That's what Christ wants for us. This church in Antioch was proof positive that anyone could be bonded by Christ. Think about this. In Acts 13:1, you have already a really diverse group of people. First of all, you're in Turkey, right? So you're in pretty much Gentile region right there. So you're among Gentiles. You've got previous Jews. You've got people from Africa. You've got a converted Jew who now is an apostle, who was actually a Pharisee and was really a radical. You've got all these group of people climbing together in this one little church in Antioch. Christ can bond anyone together by putting aside our own differences and focusing on Him. So we know that Manaen responded to God appropriately. We know that he was faithful. But lastly, Manaen was not a glory collector. Manaen was not a glory collector. Because Manaen was willing to work. Glory collectors aren't willing to get their hands dirty. Glory collectors seek glory and not progress. But glory deflectors seek God's will and not their own. And notice the contrast. We have glory collectors and then glory deflectors. The English language is a great thing to make little rhymes everywhere. That's awesome. It just sounds great. We need to be glory deflectors instead of glory collectors. I will tell you from personal experience that cleaning the building on Sunday or Saturday evenings is not a fun thing. It is not a glory collecting activity. In fact, people may come in the next day and say, these windows are kind of dirty. When I'm not paying attention to the sermon, I kind of want to be looking out the window at the squirrels and other assorted animals. You might get frustrated. People might not accept or appreciate your work. It's not a very glory collecting activity. But this is the kind of activity that Manaen was willing to go through. The epistle's right. The epistle tells us that prophets and teachers, they were under double scrutiny because they were in charge of delivering the message of God to people. So if they were misquoting God in that way, they were going to be held doubly responsible. But Manaen was willing to take on that position. Manaen was willing to be scrutinized. Manaen was willing to get his hands dirty. He was not a glory collector. Manaen was a glory deflector. Also, we know that Manaen is only mentioned once in the Bible. He's mentioned once. Come on, man. Once? How many times did Jesus mention the Bible? A bajillion times. How many times has God mentioned the Bible? A bajillion times, rightfully so. What about the Apostle Paul? He's everywhere. Peter, James, and John, they're all through the Gospels. Why not Manaen? Was he any worse than the other guys? Was he any less valuable than anyone else? Why was Manaen mentioned only once in the Bible? Well, really it's because numeric value is not the only thing that's important to one in a life. What about Melchizedek? Do we conclude that Melchizedek was important? Well, in Hebrews he's mentioned 8 times alone. But in the entire Bible, Melchizedek's mentioned 10 times. 2 in Genesis, 8 in Hebrews. Melchizedek was important because Melchizedek allowed that avenue that Christ could be both a priest and a king. Essentially, and not just taking anything away from the divine kingship of Christ, but essentially, without Melchizedek's example, without his position there in Genesis, Christ would not have been able to be a priest king as he was. Consequently, we would not have had our sins atoned for in the exact same way, if not for Melchizedek. He's an incredibly important individual, but he's only mentioned 10 times. Importance is not always determined by numeric value. Also, we know that Manaen may have been tempted to rub elbows with Luke. We know that Luke was recording all the Acts of the Apostles. Everywhere that the Apostles would go, Luke would try to be there. If he couldn't be there, he would get the information from someone else and he would write it down. Do you think maybe Manaen saw that? Remember where Manaen comes from. Manaen comes from a lifestyle where you are socially adept. You are recognized as an individual in a community. You're receiving attention. You're receiving some kind of grace by someone else who's lower than you. Do you think maybe Manaen in this church at Antioch saw that they were being recorded? You think maybe he saw people were getting glory that should have been God's? And would that have been tempting to someone who maybe lived that life before? But apparently Manaen was okay with being mentioned once. In fact, Manaen was being mentioned almost in passing. There was this person, and Manaen, who knew Herod, and somebody else. He was not willing to subject himself to his former lifestyle. He was not willing to seek out the glory for his own. Instead, he wanted to deflect glory to God, who he recognized as the supreme being in the universe. And another reason we know that is because Luke was not afraid to record people's character flaws. We're reading Acts 8 of Simon the sorcerer, right? Simon the sorcerer, he becomes converted, but before in his life, he was a kind of magician. He fooled people with these fake magics. And what he saw from the apostles was a real gift. He saw some kind of divine power given to them. And it was the ability to have some kind of gifts and also to bestow the gift on someone else. Now, to Simon the sorcerer, someone who made money on this stuff in his previous life, he's thinking, man, if I could buy that gift, people would line up for miles to come see me and get these gifts that I have. I would be rich. And that's what he asked the apostles. Please, let me pay you some money and give me these gifts that you have. What did the apostles say? Literally translated, your money and yourself go to hell. Not to be crude or rude or anything like that, but that's exactly how it's translated. You can take your money, you can take your former lifestyle, and it will lead you to hell. Manaen was not willing to go back to his life. Manaen was willing to look forward. He was willing to be a glory deflector for God. And Manaen probably really wouldn't have cared at all if he was ever mentioned in any way in the Bible. Manaen was satisfied with being known alone to God. Man's Lord will receive man's reward. And I say that to say this. The only thing we should be worried about, the only recognition that we should seek today is the one that's written in the book of life. Look at Revelation 3, verse 5. Revelation 3, 5. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Manaen knew this. Manaen recognized this principle. Could Manaen have gone back to his ways? Could Manaen maybe have been in a position of power after Herod died? I don't know. But the point is that Manaen saw his previous lifestyle. He saw the way he was living would get him nowhere. And instead of turning back to that, what he decided to do was follow after God. He realized that the only place he really needs to be worried about being mentioned is in God's book of life. Fame. Fortune. Recognition. We all see it. In some ways, it's natural. We need some kind of affection. So we have a choice to make. Because we think we need this fame, because we think we need this recognition and this power, if you will, this social prowess, we could look for it in the world. We could. Maybe I could become a good writer. No, I'm just kidding. Maybe I could do something with my life that would give me a lot of attention personally. Maybe I could do something that would give me all the glory. And maybe for a while, I would think I would be happy. Maybe for a while, like Solomon in Ecclesiastes, I would be satisfied. I would be tempered, if you will. But if you ever read the end of Ecclesiastes, you'll know that Solomon's conclusion was not the same. Solomon tried his whole life to find something that he couldn't find under the sun. Solomon tried his whole life to get somewhere that he couldn't get because it was above the sun. We can do the same thing if you so desire. If you really want to, you can try and find peace. You can try and find ultimate pleasure for the world, but you won't get it. That's not me talking from experience or being pompous. That's just the Bible talking to us this morning. Instead, we need to realize that we need to be like Manaen. We need to understand that the recognition that we have in the world, the recognition that we have among our neighbors and our peers, means nothing in the end. You could be a president in your life. You could be a rock star in your life. You could be the most important person on the face of the earth in your life. And people will read about you in history books. People would make, charities in your name. People make buildings in your name, statues, and you could be a great historical figure. Wouldn't you want to be like Julius Caesar? No, you wouldn't be like Julius Caesar. Pick a different example. Wouldn't you want to be like George Washington? Yes. Crossing the Delaware, leading armies, first president of the United States. Awesome. You could do that. But where do you think any of these historical figures are going to be at judgment? Are they going to come before the Almighty and He's going to step back and say, wow, you're so-and-so. You lived from this time period to this time period. You did so-and-so and so-and-so. Yeah, come on in. You're famous. You're popular. You think that's what Manaen's going to do? Manaen wasn't willing to give back his life because he understood that once he got to judgment, it wasn't going to be, yeah, you're Manaen. Acts 13:1, right? Hey, man, sorry about all that non-recognition. Come on in. Come on. We know you wanted to be recognized. Manaen was okay with being under the radar. Manaen was okay just living for the Lord and being a glory deflector. We need to do the same. But it's hard because we all want fame. We all want recognition in some way. I want to encourage you this morning to find the Lord. I want to encourage you to look for recognition in the book of life that we find in Revelation 3:5. If you have a need this morning to have the prayers for encouragement, if you need to change your life, if you need help struggling, or if you're struggling and you need help, we're certainly here for you. You have elders who love you. You have a congregation who is definitely with you. We've been through things together. We've experienced things. We know that we're not perfect. We know that. We're not asking you to be perfect. No one's asking you to be perfect. We're asking you to give yourself to God. We're asking you to give yourself to something that's better than any of us are. If you have a need to be baptized and need to dedicate your life to God, that's your personal choice. I could try and stand up here all day and try and convince you to do that. I could say the nicest words in the most delicate ways possible, but ultimately it's going to be up to you. Ultimately it's going to be up to you what you find important. Just like Manaen did. He found out what was important the hard way, but then he pursued it. Then he really, really went after it. That's what I want to encourage you this morning. If you need help with someone privately, please seek us out after services. We're happy to help you in any way. Whatever your needs this morning, I pray you can make it known. As together we stand and sing.